you would take your Bibles tonight and turn to Genesis chapter 12, and we'll get started there in just a moment. It's good to be with you again tonight, the final night of this gospel meeting. Found out tonight that David Tomley gets to go through Friday night, and so I found out that maybe you had enough and you couldn't stand anymore. No, I thank you for the opportunity very much to be here this week. I love Limestone County. Oftentimes when I'm out of town, I'll tell people Athens is a great place to go to heaven from. And that's really the way I hope it works out for me. If God's willing, I hope my next move will be from here to there. And when I was talking to the elders at Decatur, I told them that I really had an interest in the work there, but I just didn't want to move if that was possible. And they said, well, we won't make you. And so it's just been a joy to be able to still be here in this county, to still get to see you all from time to time, and to be with you this week, and to have the opportunity to preach the gospel. Everything has been outstanding. The meals have been wonderful that we have been able to enjoy in your homes. I thank you for your warm hospitality, and most of all, just for the warmth and conversation that we got to enjoy in those homes. And I appreciate the work that's being done here. There's an enthusiasm, and your members are talking to me about how much they love Jones Road. And when you get that, you know good things are happening. I knew of Jonathan prior to him coming here. I had not heard him speak, but somewhere along the way I had the opportunity to listen to him online, and I thought to myself, now he's good. And I knew that was going to be a good thing, and I appreciate the work that they're doing. And I know that together you will continue to accomplish great things together. I want to thank the shepherds here for their confidence in me and for inviting Susan and I to come. And we're so thankful to have had this week together. Come see us anytime you can. We'd love to see you down in Decatur. We're a small group, and so if you're ever traveling through and need a place to stop, it would really mean a lot to us to see you. So again, thank you from the bottom of our hearts for everything that you have done for us. You know, in our preaching, we talk a lot about the need to walk in the steps of Jesus. And that's absolutely so. That's the ultimate. But did you realize that there's another person in the Bible that says we need to walk in his steps? That's said about Abraham. In Romans chapter 4, he's referred to as the father of us all. And we are to walk in the steps of the faith which our father Abraham had. Do you remember Abraham's story? Abraham was called to leave his home. That had to be hard. God just appears to him and says, I want you to get up and go. And so he makes a trip. Some have said that trip was well over 1,000 miles or more as he makes his trip to the land of Canaan. And as Abraham travels, there's two things that you see everywhere he goes. I'd like to begin reading these passages tonight, and you see if these two things jump out at you as to what they are. We'll start in Genesis chapter 12, beginning in verse 5. It says, Then Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people whom they had acquired in Haran, and they departed to go to the land of Canaan, and so they came to the land of Canaan. And Abram passed through the land to a place of Shechem, as far as the terebinth tree of Moreh, and the Canaanites were then in the land. And the Lord appeared to Abram and said, To your descendants I will give this land. And there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. And he moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east, and there he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of his Lord. Did you see them? Look at Genesis 13, verse 3. We'll look at it again. He went on his journey from the south as far as Bethel to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar, which he had made there at the first, and there Abram called on the name of his Lord. Did you see it that time? In Genesis 13 and verse 18, one more time, it says in verse 18, Then Abraham moved his tent, and he went and dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. Probably because of the way I was emphasizing that, you certainly saw it. Everywhere he goes, we see a tent and we see an altar. And what I'd like to suggest to you in those two things tonight is those two things show us how Abraham viewed life. It also shows us how he viewed the world that he lived in, how he felt about this world. And we also see in this where home really was to him. And so tonight I want to talk about tents and altars, living between two worlds. First thing I'd like to suggest is that the tent preaches a lot of lessons. The major thing it preaches is that this world is temporary. We're just passing through. As I mentioned, Abraham travels over 1,000 miles to get to Canaan. But he gets there and he understands that this is not home. Do you realize that as wealthy as he was, he never owned any land in the land of Canaan except a little field. And in that field there was a cave, and he bought that little piece of property and that cave only as a means for burying his family. Now, him not buying land never had anything to do with his inability. He could have bought a whole bunch of it. He had plenty of money. It really wasn't about that. Turn to Hebrews 11 now, and I want you to notice some things that are said in Hebrews chapter 11. We'll look at verse 9 and 10. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 9. Concerning Abraham, it said, "By faith he sojourned in the land of promise, as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents, with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city that has foundations, whose builder and maker is God." And then when you look at verse 13, concerning him and those like him, it said, "These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, they were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were just strangers and pilgrims on the earth." That says a whole lot about how Abraham viewed things. He could see, this is not it. This is not my home. And really, that's what his tent says. You put it up for a little while, you take it down. It's just temporary in nature. You know, and we need to see that too. But it certainly is hard in a country that's got an epidemic that I call affluenza. You notice I didn't say influenza. Affluence, wealth, prosperity still, and in a place where everybody just keeps talking about the American dream. And yet in so many cases that affluence is killing us. It is killing spirituality. And even Jesus said so, that the riches and the cares of this world and the pleasures of life will choke the word, and it doesn't bring forth any fruit. We just don't need to get so wrapped up in it. And one of the things you see is that Abraham certainly didn't. I love what you see in Genesis 13 when he and Lot began to have some issues, at least their herdsmen did, because there's just so many of us and there's not a lot of grazing land, and the herdsmen are beginning to have strife with one another, and they've got to somehow settle this matter. And so in Genesis 13 and verse 6, it says, "The land was not able to support them, that they might dwell together, for their possessions were so great, and they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abraham's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock, and the Canaanites and Perizzites then dwelt in the land." Now look at what Abraham does. Verse 8. "So Abram said to Lot, 'Please let there be no strife between you and me, and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we're brethren.' And then he says, 'Is not the whole land before us? Please separate from me. If you take to the left, I'll go to the right. If you take to the right, I'll go to the left.'" And of course we know Lot lifted his eyes and he saw the plains there, the well-watered plains of Jordan, and that's where he had to go. But it seems like with Abraham that it was just more like, you know, you go that way, I'll go this way, or if you go that way, I'll go this. He doesn't seem to care. It doesn't seem to matter a whole lot to him. You just see that he's just not so wrapped up in it. And neither do we need to be, because the fact of the matter is, it's all going to be destroyed one day. It's all going to go away. And we have to remember that. In fact, Peter spent a lot of time helping us to see that in 2 Peter chapter 3, beginning in verse 4, helping us to see that this world is one day going to be destroyed. He talks about those who will come in the last days and they'll be mocking and basically like, where's the promise of His coming? And he says they'll say this in verse 4, "For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation." It's almost like they're saying, we get up, we go to work, we come home, we go to bed, we get up, we go to work, we come home, we go to bed, we go home, we get up, and it just goes on and on. Every day we're just doing the same old thing, and nothing's happening, and it just looks like to me nothing's going to happen. And so their argument for the Lord not coming is that nothing's changing. Everything's just kind of the same. And Peter makes the point, don't you remember it was kind of a normal day when the flood came? Don't you remember that every day was kind of just like another? But that day was different than all of them. And so don't think that things going along nice and tidy and neat and the same thing every day, don't think that that means nothing's going to happen, because he says, verse 5, "For this they willfully forget." They choose to forget it. "That by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. But then the heavens and the earth which now exist are kept in store by the same word, reserved for fire, until the day of judgment and the perdition of ungodly men." I like what he says there, that everything came into existence. If I was in a Bible class, I would do it this way. The world came into existence when God spoke. The flood all of a sudden came on mankind when God spoke. And the reason the world is still standing is because God has not yet spoken. And his point is, it's going to happen. He says in verse 8, "Beloved, do not forget this one thing, that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day." What's the passing of time to God? To an eternal God that's always been, 1,000 years is just like to Him. But the Lord is not slack concerning His promise, as some count slackness, but He is long-suffering toward us. That's why nothing's happened, because God is waiting on you to come to Him. He's long-suffering toward us, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. And then the stern reminder in verse 10, "The day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a great noise, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Both the earth and the works that are in it will be burned up." It's going to be destroyed. Name me one city that really has foundations. Hurricane Katrina. I remember several years ago, one night I was just flipping through the channels, and there was a show on television that was titled, "It Could Really Happen." And that night they were talking about New Orleans. And they were talking about how it's so many feet below sea level. And they talked about the right conditions that could come about one day that would mean absolute disaster for New Orleans. It could happen. Well, you know what? It did. Katrina came and absolutely devastated everything. People's lives were lost. People are swept away by floodwaters. One thing after another has happened as New Orleans is completely destroyed. And you know what? A lot of people had to dwell in tents. They're left living in tents. Abraham is telling us there's no city that really has foundations here below. Abraham was looking for the city that had foundations, whose builder and maker was God. There is only one kingdom that is going to last forever, and that is the kingdom of our Lord. In Matthew the 13th chapter, look at verse 44. In Matthew 13 and verse 44, we see the value of the kingdom of God. Matthew 13, verse 44. It says, "The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which a man finds, and he hides it. And for joy over it, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field." Can you imagine that people must have thought he was crazy? They don't realize that he has gone and he has looked at this piece of land. It doesn't seem to be so much, but he knows and he has found a treasure there. He hides it. And then he goes and sells everything he has. He's getting rid of everything he has to accumulate enough money to buy that field. That's exactly what we have. The kingdom of Jesus Christ is worth surrendering it all. And then we have a double use of that idea in verse 45. The kingdom of heaven is like a merchant seeking beautiful pearls, who, when he had found one pearl of great price, went and sold all that he had and bought it. So don't get so entangled in it. Don't get so wrapped up. 1 John chapter 2 is a passage that seems to be quoted a lot for good reason. 1 John chapter 2 reminds us of this very stark reminder. He says, "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world is the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life. All of that is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world is passing away, and the lust of it. But he who does the will of God abides forever." It's just a reminder that we can go out and we can try to grab as much of it as we like, and one day we find out it's sifted through our hands like sand. It's passing away. But only those who do the will of God will live forever. And then in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 11, we're again reminded of that sentiment that was said about Abraham. This world is not my home, I'm just passing through. 1 Peter 2 and verse 11 says, "Beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lust, which war against the soul." Don't get entangled. And let me say this, pack lightly. Pack lightly. You know, Paul said in 1 Timothy chapter 6, concerning riches, he said in 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 9 that those who desire to be rich fall into temptation and into a snare and into many foolish and harmful lusts which drown men in destruction and perdition. Previously in verse 7 he had said, "We brought nothing into this world, and it is certain that we will carry nothing out." I've always liked that comment about, have you ever seen a hearse pulling a U-Haul trailer behind it? It just doesn't happen, does it? Kind of reminds me of a man who had a whole lot and he had died, and two men are standing there and they're looking at his body, and one of them kind of whispers to the other and says, "I wonder how much he left." And the other guy said, "All of it." And that's exactly the way that happens. Paul Earnhardt one time said, when he was in his 70s, he's passed on now, he said, "I'm at the point that I'm having a lot of yard sales. What do I need with all of this stuff?" And I've heard gospel preachers who have talked about moving to other countries. You know, you go over there, you're going to be there for a little while, and they'll get them a house, but they don't buy a lot of furniture. They don't put up a lot of decorative stuff on the walls. And they say, because we know that it's not going to be long, we're going to go home. They don't get too entangled because they know they're just there for a little while. And we need to remember the same thing concerning our lives. Bottom line is our investments are just better placed somewhere else. In Matthew the 6th chapter and verse 19, Jesus in that masterpiece Sermon on the Mount said in verse 19, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Lay up treasures in a place where it cannot go away. It's going to be waiting for you. It's all sent toward heaven. That's where our investments are best placed. I love the quote that said this, "He is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." And that's exactly what we're saying here. You are not a foolish man at all who's willing to give up everything he has to gain what he can't lose. That's the idea in all of this. Can you see that? That his tent, you set it up, you take it down. You set it up, you take it down. It's temporary. And that tent preaches a major message that he understood. It's all temporary, and I'm just passing through. But then let's talk about his altar for just a moment. His altar preaches something pretty interesting too. His altar preaches that there's another world. I mean, wouldn't that be the idea here? You watch this man, he's kneeling before an altar, and his smoke is going up toward the heavens. His home is in the direction of the smoke. And folks, you don't have to see that. You don't have to see that with your eyes to believe that. In Hebrews, the 11th chapter, I really have come to realize that the book of Hebrews just pounds it over and over and over, that here's people who are giving their entire lives for something they've never seen. You know, you can imagine those Christians, a lot of them have converted to Judaism, and somebody says, where's your altar? Well, where's your high priest? And you have these, little places to meet that aren't very much. Where's your temple? All of our stuff is unseen stuff. But you don't have to see it with your eyes to believe it. In Hebrews, the 11th chapter, in verse 13, again he said, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them. They're seeing them afar off, were assured of them and embraced them and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. And those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. But now they desire a better, that is a heavenly country. And therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, because He has prepared a city for them. You know, Abraham had a number of opportunities that if he had chosen to, he could have gone back to Ur. But Ur's not home. And he comes to realize that Canaan is not home. Abraham could see that my real home is afar off. And you don't have to see it with your eyes to believe it. You know, I mentioned the other night, my mama passed away in 2020. And you know how sometimes we know it's coming? And we might think about something special that we might even plan to do at the moment they pass away. Sometimes we may have a song in mind that we're already pre-decided that we're going to sing that song as a moment of joy. Well, when my mom passed away, I hadn't really planned anything. I think my son-in-law had planned something. But when Mama drew her last breath, it just shot out of me. I said, "You did it, Mama, you did it." I hadn't planned it. I didn't know I was going to say that. It just came out. "You did it, Mama, you did it." And I knew right then that my faith was absolutely real. I had every belief and every assurance that she had just made her way into the paradise of God. And I don't have to see that to know that it's so. And furthermore, you don't have to see Jesus with your eyes to believe. In John 8 and verse 56, Jesus was talking about, if anybody obeys my word, he'll never see death. And who do you think you are? Abraham is dead and the prophets are dead, and you say if somebody keeps your words, you'll never die. Who do you make yourself out to be? And in that whole discourse, he says in verse 56, your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad. I don't know all that's meant by that. I don't know all that Abraham understood, but that verse seems to tell us that Abraham knew something was coming. And he did not have to see it with his eyes to believe it. Turn with me now to 1 Peter. In 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 8, we have this jewel of a verse for us that reminds us of that about Jesus. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 8, it talks about how that we're tried and we're tested, and may that be found to praise, honor, and glory at the revelation of Jesus. But then in verse 8 it says, whom having not seen, you love, though now you do not see Him, yet believing you rejoice with joy inexpressible and full of glory, receiving the end of your faith, the salvation of your souls. We don't have to see Jesus to see Jesus. To know that Jesus is true and real. And that's why I talked about it's so important to go to the Bible vividly and look at Him on the pages of Scripture. Bill Hall tells a story. I think I've got this right. There's nothing about it that would be too bad, even if I messed it up. But he tells a story about when Bruce, his son, was very little. I think the idea was that he might have been born while they were in Australia, but he had not seen the grandparents while they were in Australia. And they would show him pictures. They would show him pictures of Papaw and Mamaw. And every day they're talking about them and talking about their love for them and showing him the pictures. And Bill talks about that when they did come back home, at the airport, little Bruce looked out through there and he saw Papaw. And he ran into Papaw's arms. And all he had ever had was just pictures. And I want you to understand that we can have that same thing. We can have that same love for Jesus whom we've not seen. I know that you have that. I've heard you express that. Kind of reminds me of a movie that was out several years ago that really touched my heart. It was called My Life. And it was about a man who had cancer, and he knew that he was going to die. And his wife was pregnant with their first child when he found out. And all likelihood was he was going to die before this child was even born. And realizing that, he just wanted so much to have some kind of impact on his child's life, even though he would never be even seen by his child. So he bought a video camera. And he would set this video camera up, and he would read stories like Dr. Seuss to his child on this video camera. That Sam I am, that Sam I am, I do not like that Sam I am. And all these stories. He'd go to family reunions with it, and he'd say, this is your Uncle Bobby, and he'd talk about Uncle Bobby, and he'd do those things. And he also recorded some things he wanted this child to hear at different stages in his life, like when he gets his driver's license, and when he graduates from college, and when he marries his wife. As it turned out, he did get to see his child born, but he died shortly thereafter. But at the end of the movie, it's very interesting. The child is now just a toddler and is just able to talk. And the mom has a videotape, and she puts it in the machine, and he's watching. And for the first time, he says, Daddy. How did that happen? How did that happen? How does he feel an attachment? Daddy. The videotapes. And what I tell people all the time is that's what you have right here. I can just see him kind of saying, Mommy, let's watch this one. Let's watch this one. That's what we have. Let me read that one. Let me read that one. I know that's the way I am about different books of the Bible. When I realize I'm about to study a book of the Bible, I'm all excited, even though I've done it 5 or 6 times. And in fact, that's my favorite thing. When I was at Oakland, I always talked about covet the nugget. And that stuck. And I love that because every once in a while, somebody will say to me, they'll say, Jeff, I found a nugget. And what they mean by that is something I'd never seen before that had a real profound effect on them. Jesus is real. You don't have to see Him with your eyes to believe it. There is another world. And you need to know that the most real things there are the things that you cannot see. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, beginning in verse 16, 2 Corinthians chapter 4, beginning in verse 16. Paul says, "Therefore we do not lose heart, even though our outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. While we do not look at the things which are seen, but rather at the things which are unseen, not seen. For the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal." Do you realize that? If you can see it with your eyes, kiss it goodbye. One day this building is going to be destroyed. All these pews will be gone. All the songbooks will be gone. Everything about this will be gone. In fact, there's only one thing I know in this building tonight that's going to last forever. You know what it is? Your soul. Your soul. And you can't see it. I've never seen your soul. I know you've got one. Do you get it? The things that are real and lasting and eternal are the things that cannot be seen. It preaches there's another world. But let me stress this. His altar also preaches that worshiping God is top priority. We had this similar thought other day in a lesson here. When the Israelites encamped and they put up that tent, some campfire, isn't it? The Shekinah, the glory of God resting over the tabernacle at night. But the thing that I want you to see is that they are encamped around the tabernacle. The center of their world is God, right dead center of that encampment. And God's people do that. We always keep God right at the center of our life. And no matter where we go, it is evident that He is the centerpiece. In fact, our word worship is a combination of two words, worthship. And what we're simply saying is that He is worthy. He is worthy of all my devotion. And that act of worship begins when I become a Christian. The language of Romans chapter 12 is that we do not conform to this world, but we transform. And it furthermore says to offer our bodies as living sacrifices to God. I put myself on the altar. My whole self is in. I'm giving all of me to Him. Begin with worship of God. I want you to think about this concerning Abraham. Abraham was in a land where people would set their idols up and worship their idols. I know he had to look awful strange. He's got an altar. But where's his God? And it had to demonstrate to them that he has a God that he cannot see, that he loves with every fiber of his being. And he's not afraid for his neighbors to see that. He's not afraid for them to see him there before his altar. And I want to encourage you to be the same way. In your everyday life, don't ever be ashamed to let people see where your absolute devotion is. It's powerful when other people see it. You remember there in Acts chapter 16, the story when Paul was in the prison? And they were singing and praying they were praying and singing hymns to God. And the whole thing begins to rattle and shake and to fall apart. And you think about the jailer. These are men that have been beaten. They've been thrown in prison, but yet they're singing and they're praying to God. And they're not talking about how terribly bad they've been treated. They look like they have joy. And in the middle of one of those stanzas, the whole place falls apart. And the jailer goes to them and he's about to take his life. And they said, "Do yourself no harm, we're all here." And he said, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" He knew what the center of their world was. Another thing I think we need to know is that worship does not stop here at this building. You know, there was a big controversy a while back among members of the church about people saying that all of life is worship. I never saw what the big deal was. I think part of it was is they were trying to say that whatever I can do out there that's an act of worship I can do here, and that's just not true. There's things that I can do privately that we cannot do corporately. But I do believe the Bible teaches that I am a priest 24/7. I don't check out. I remember D. Bowman said one time somebody had made him so bad, and he said, it made him so mad, he said, I just wanted to punch him. He said, I just want to tell God, if you'll just give me 30 seconds off, I can take care of this. But he said, God won't give me 30 seconds off. I'm a priest 24/7, and all of my life is worship to God. I never check out. Everything I'm doing is aimed toward Him. And Paul viewed his life that way. Turn to Philippians chapter 4, and I want you to catch this. Philippians chapter 4. In Philippians chapter 4, verse 16, Paul says concerning the Philippians, he said, even in Thessalonica you sent aid once and again for my necessities. But I want you to see what he calls these things that they sent to him. Verse 18, indeed I have all and abound, I am full, having received from Epaphroditus the things that were sent from you, a sweet-smelling aroma, an acceptable sacrifice, well-pleasing to God. Y'all, that's worship language. When you do something to help another person, it is an act of worship. It is done for our God. And he puts it in worship tones. But I also find it interesting that Paul even viewed his life. I think even the last moments of it, that it can be a sacrifice to God. Look at Philippians just a moment again, this time in chapter 2 and verse 17. In Philippians 2 and verse 17, he's talking about his death, and he says, yes, and if I am being poured out as a drink offering, on the sacrifice and service of your faith, I am glad and I rejoice with you all. Let me just step down here for just a moment. If I am poured out as a drink offering on the sacrifice and service of your faith, it looks like to me that he is picturing what they have done as a sacrifice. But he said it may be that I'm about to be poured out as a drink offering. In the Old Testament, they would oftentimes take a drink offering and they would pour it on top of the sacrifice. So here's Paul saying, here's what you have done, a sacrifice to God. And it may be that I'm about to die, and it'll be on top of what you have done, and all of it is given as a sacrifice unto God. When I was in Brundage, Alabama, there was a lady down there whose name was Laurette. She was one of those mamas that Jesus gave me in the church. You know, he said that there would be mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters. One time there were some elders that had gone from Fayetteville to, I think they were on their way to Florida, and they stopped in at Brundage, and Miss Laurette found out that they were elders where I preached, and she was all excited, and she said, are y'all taking care of my boy? They said, oh, yes, ma'am, we sure are. She said, good, because if you don't think you can, you just send him right on back down here, and we'll take care of him. I loved her. I preached her funeral. When Miss Laurette was in the hospital, the nurses came to love her so very much. She was just that kind. Brother Woodruff one day wanted to lean over and kiss her, and they had a rail, you know how they have on the hospital beds, because she had cancer in her hip, and it was just terrible. And in fact, she had rolled over in bed and broke her hip, and they were going to have to do surgery. And he's leaning down trying to get over that rail, and he's trying to kiss her, and he's reaching down as far as he can reach, and she's reaching up as far as she can reach, and they're shaking, and their lips just never touch. And she just fell back to the bed, and she said, Pa, I don't think it's much worth it anymore. And nurses there seeing that said, no, you kiss your bride. And so they let the rail down, and he kissed her. When she went to surgery, the nurses begged for her to come back to their floor. And she did. And when Miss Laurette passed away, they all began to sing praises to God. The doctor who was there called upon her daughter Ann to come out to the hallway. And he said, Ann, I want to tell you something. He said, I've never been too impressed with the Church of Christ. He said, but you folks have changed my mind. And the whole time she was begging God to go home. Let me go home. And I just wonder if he said, nope, I got you right where I want you. And even in death, it's a final act of worship unto God. Well, let's just make this last point somewhat quickly, these last two. His altar preached total faith and trust in God. I think most of those altars that we've been talking about were probably pretty easy to build. I think they probably were pretty easy to build. But there was one that God called upon him to build that had to be the heaviest stones he had ever picked up in all his life. In Genesis, he was told, Abraham, yes, Lord, go and offer your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, on the mountains of Moriah. And he gets up early the next morning, he and Isaac, and they make their way up that mountain. And I don't know how young he was, but a young man's voice begins to speak, and he says, Father, we have the wood, and we have the fire, but where's the lamb? That had to rip Abraham's heart out. And he said, my son, God will provide for himself a lamb for the burnt offering. Don't you know those stones were hard to build for that altar? And then to place your son on it and to draw your knife back. And God say, Abraham, don't lay a hand. For now I know that you fear God and that you have not withheld your only son from me. Abraham's altar preaches total faith and trust in God, even when this made no sense at all. Godly people never leave their altars. You remember when David lost his son? And he's just on the ground and they try to get him to eat and he's just in a mess because his son is dying. And then he hears his servants whispering and he says, is the child dead? And they said, he's dead. And the Bible said he got up and he washed his face and he changed his clothes and he went to the house of God and worshiped. We never leave it. We never leave our place of worship. It has been said of Abraham that Abraham had trust when he didn't know where he was going. He didn't know when the promises would be fulfilled. He didn't know how. He didn't even have a child. And Sarah's old. And he didn't know why. Sacrifice the promised son? What sense does this make? Abraham's altar preaches faith and trust in God. And then lastly, don't ever leave your altar. You know, when he went down into Egypt, I don't read about an altar. Remember that time in Egypt? And he kind of got in trouble. Sarah, got in trouble. They took Sarah and it's just a mess. But I don't read anything about an altar during that time. I'm not trying to make too much of that. I just don't see it. And I do see Abraham starting to rely on himself. Don't tell him you're my wife. Tell him you're my sister. Somebody said that was a half truth, but it was a whole lie. And he's a little. He needs to get calibrated. In all of this. But he makes his way back. And so when you come to Genesis 13, verse 3 and 4, we're told again that he went on his journey from the south as far as Bethel to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there at the first. And there Abraham called on the name of his God. He's right back where he started. Don't ever leave your altar. Sometimes I see people that I don't understand. I don't know what gets in them, but they're just done, and they go off and they go wild. And in fact, I've got a preacher friend right now that I'm so proud of. He's not preaching full time. He's actually in a nursing home, but he's already converted 3 people. But he went through that. He called me one day and he said, "I'm tired of it. I'm leaving. I'm going to another county. I've met me a woman there that he didn't have a right to." And he just tells me about what all he's going to go do. And I told him on the phone, I said, "You better have all the fun you can, because you will have none when this life is over." A couple of years later, he called me up and he was crying and he said, "I want to come home." And now he'll look at me and he'll get that nose and raise it up like I do, and he'll say, "You better have all the fun you can." He appreciates it now. Why did he do that? Why did he leave? Just to end up right back where he was. I had a lady one time to tell me that. I don't know why I did it. I don't know why I left. When you're going to be right back at it one day if you come back to God. Why do we leave it in the first place? This is where it's at. Don't leave your altar. The lesson's yours. If you need to respond to the gospel tonight, we hope that you will. All this week I've been talking about it being a total surrender. That's what it is. You don't really begin to live until you die. And we don't trust that sometimes. To just totally, I'm done. I'm giving it all to you. I'm open to you, wide open. That's when life gets good. That's when life becomes fulfilling. Tonight, would you lay it all down? Would you allow yourself to be buried in the waters of baptism and say good riddance to that old man and rise to walk in new life? Live your life faithful to God and let Him transform you day by day, moment by moment, into the likeness of God, into the likeness of Jesus. Would you? Come while we stand and as we sing together.